Hello and welcome to the War Report. Now we are back with a whole new episode. Of course, we're going to start out just with the Ukraine elections, just get right into it because that happened this weekend and oh boy, were those something. So I'll pull up my maps and graphics right here. So I'll turn on the screen share so you can see it if Google will bear with me here because they're wonderful software which we're so dependent on. But yeah, until we can find an alternative, I guess that is it. So um, and there we go. So you can see those?
I can't, but that's fine.
Yeah, okay, I'll just turn it off then. Yeah, wonderful production stuff. I'm sure this is what people tune in for. But uh, Volodymyr Zelensky won in a landslide. Now, of course, he is our comedian friend who has won the Ukrainian elections. And uh, let's just get right into it. So he won in the second round of the Ukrainian elections on a landslide on Sunday with over 70% of the vote. As you can see here, he won 73.2% of the vote. Now, Russian television and media both laughed at and welcomed this victory. Now, Medvedev, the prime minister of Russia, said he expects Mr. Zelensky to, quote, repeat familiar ideological formulas, and that he used in the election campaign. And he also said, I have no illusion that of this. Here, let me read his exact quote. He added, I have no illusions on that score. At the same time, there's a chance to improve relations between our countries. Now, it's also speculated that Zelensky wants to open up dialogue with the Donbass separatists, and Poroshenko is actually bucking tradition, saying he wishes to remain in Ukrainian politics despite losing the election. Now, traditionally, if someone loses an election in Ukraine, they just go off and they retire.
Yeah, I mean this reminds me a little bit of what sort of a trend that's developed in America of previous presidents going on talking circuits, trying to influence upcoming elections, giving opinions at particular moments. And my guess is the reason he's done that is because basically America is interested in him maintaining some kind of presence there.
Yeah, he's still beholden to his
Uh,
overlords.
yeah, I was going to avoid saying that, but essentially that's it. So he's going to try to remain relevant. And honestly, like I think for people in the West, and I think even for people in Russia, we should be cautious about what could possibly be achieved with Zelensky as president. I mean, perhaps in some way his lack of experience will show a certain amount of incompetency that could work well for the region. But and I'm sure they're not particularly happy about the outcome. But I think they knew. I think after the first round that Zelensky was going to win. Despite that, Merkel, of course, congratulated Poroshenko on making it to the second round. So I think they're disappointed in the outcome, but they will try to do as much to counteract the negatives, as it were, in a very similar way with Trump's election.
Yeah. Now, my thing about Zelensky is, as somebody who has, you could say, spoke out against the neoliberal world order, against this whole American hegemony, I am more eager as to what he's not going to do than what I think he actually can do. I think his flubs and his inaction will ultimately be more beneficial than whatever he actually does in terms of policy.
Right, right, and the Russian showbiz stars in film and theater are very happy about Zelensky's victory. I don't know if they can persuade him.
Yeah, and just in terms of election outcomes, so for those of you seeing on the map right here, you can see pretty much every country in the world, the Ukrainian diaspora with Ukrainian citizens, they voted for Poroshenko. And I looked up the figures from at least London, and the Ukrainian diaspora were, of course, very pro Poroshenko. Now, out of all the Ukrainians who voted at the embassy in London, 70% voted Poroshenko, 28% for Zelensky, and 2% invalid ballots. Now, you actually look at the numbers, it's the inverse of how the election played out back at home.
Yeah, they don't have to live there.
Oh, of course. Now, and now just to go on about the election results, pretty much only this western district near Lviv is the only district he won a majority in.
Yeah, which was predictable because
Yeah.
yeah. So
Isn't
no
that
one's
where?
surprised by
Isn't
that.
that where he's actually from too? Isn't he like a Western Ukrainian?
I'm not sure. You know what? He didn't learn to speak actual Ukrainian until a few years ago. And it's quite true. His wife is from Chicago,
Oh boy.
and she knew, but he didn't actually. So he's been taking lessons and so on. And of course, Ukraine also just passed a law for Ukrainian as the dominant language amongst any branch of government, amongst doctors and professionals, and anyone caught advocating for bilingualism or dual language in Ukraine faces a 10-year prison sentence. So they're going to really push this. So
Okay, that
you
that
know,
law seems like something like Russia would have wanted. I mean, how much is that going to inflame ethnic tensions more so than already is? I mean, this law is
it
a
will.
godsend for Russia right now.
Right, and now the Donetsk and Lugansk regions, of course, have very easy access towards passports.
Yeah, yeah,
It was something that was long overdue, uh, but yeah, the animosity is intended to stay there for generations, and but that's not going to serve Ukraine very well
oh,
long
absolutely
term
not. I
because
mean,
it won't endear anyone to come back. So
yeah, like I said, the what's been happening for the past 4 years is going to continue happening. The Ukrainians that hate Russia are either going to go to Poland or Germany or even the U.S., whereas the Ukrainians who are more pro-Russian or neutral on the issue are they're just going to move to Russia. I mean, honestly, that's what's going to happen. Now, of course, the election outcome was no surprise. At first, I thought maybe they'll sabotage Zelensky, but after a certain point, you had to realize if they were going to do something, they would have done it already. Now, Russia knows that Zelensky could possibly be putting their hands, yet they also realize that he might very well be putting the EU and U.S. hands. So it's going to be interesting to see the diplomatic maneuvers that the West takes and that the Russians take. Now, Poroshenko, of course, he lost because he was an incompetent buffoon. And Timoshenko was so corrupt and wishy-washy by even Ukrainian standards that the people didn't vote for. So Zelensky was pretty much the last logical option. Now, Ukraine has also found itself in between. No, I'll get off on that later. But yeah, pretty much Timoshenko too corrupt and wishy-washy by even Russian standards, and Poroshenko even too incompetent by Ukrainian standards. So Zelensky kind of just walked into this.
right, in a way it's a desperate move on the Ukrainian people. I don't think 8 years ago they would have voted for him. Um, it really lets you know what the cultural, economic, and political climate is like in Ukraine right now. Zelensky is really a shot in the dark. No one is certain what could happen, and maybe they're looking at this also as a blank slate, and looking to put maybe the Poroshenko years behind them. Um, the from say from a patriotic Ukrainian perspective, this was not a successful revolution. There was a lot lost, and a lot of unfinished business. I think for Ukrainians who are more neutral and want to get on with their lives, say normie Ukrainians who are interested in basically what is going to be done about the economic state of affairs in Ukraine. Zelensky maybe perhaps a kind of a neutral choice. Parrots certain lines that would, give them some kind of comfort that he's on Ukraine's side. But again, he has no experience in politics at all.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. But
um, yeah, go ahead.
just looking at Ukraine over the past decade, so you had Yanukovych, who was overthrown, but pretty much he governed the country. He was corrupt, of course. All of them, especially in that region of the world, are corrupt. But he governed the country pretty much as a Russian vassal state, and he played nice to the EU when he had to. But ultimately, Ukraine, it was normal. People lived fine lives, as comparative to the region. And really, there wasn't much trouble. Then you had these Western agitators who were, of course, backed by the U.S. and EU. The people like Poroshenko, the whole Maidan crowd, who will come in and say, we're going to, make Ukraine to an independent nationalist power, but then the Russians seize Crimea. There's separatism in the east, in the Donbass and Luhansk, and all that region. And then, of course, the economy starts to, fumble, and life generally gets worse. It doesn't even stay the same as it was. So, yeah, the revolution was a complete failure, and I imagine if you ask your average Ukrainian, not in public, but you can talk to them in private, no biases at all, no outside pressures, they'd probably say, yeah, I would take back Yanukovych and the Russian domination we had in the early 2010s any day.
Right, because and as life gets progressively worse, the anti-Russia position will seem more and more futile and unproductive.
It just seems
or rather irrelevant.
Yeah.
What is the point about obsessing over Russia? And in many ways, as some Russian television shows have joked, is that Ukraine doesn't appear to actually have a solid identity, in that when it comes to their independence, phone calls are made immediately to Merkel and to Washington, whoever happens to be there. One newscaster joked that, well, when Scotland was seeking its independence from the UK, were they phoning Paris? Were they phoning Washington? Were they phoning Tokyo to let them know? No, they simply went along and did it. But Ukraine doesn't seem to show this kind of a resolve or an interest in, what independence would entail. So there's a lack of confidence as well internally. How much are they cognizant of that, or how much sense of defeatism is present in the public that works its way all the way to the elites? I would say is probably quite a lot.
Yeah, and just to oversimplify the situation, I would say that Ukraine's identity is pretty much just Russian with Polish characteristics.
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of structurally, it's Russian more or less, and it has a lot of Polish loan words.
Yeah. Now, Zelensky, being president-elect, has walked into his first crisis beyond just Crimea, beyond just the Donbass. Ukraine has found itself in the middle of a minor gas dispute between Russia and Belarus. Now, Belarus has ceased oil and gas exports to the Baltics, Poland, and Ukraine due to concerns over energy quality. They say the oil is not up to par as to what they feel comfortable exporting. Now, Belarus has said they want to seek energy from other countries, but I wouldn't make too much of this spat, because Belarus pretty much depends on Russia for its existence, and is likely to unify with Russia over the next year or two.
Yeah, I would agree, and this may be a bargaining move on their part.
Yeah, but
somehow I doubt. I doubt it's a quality issue. This is the same gas and oil that Europe receives, and not to mention several other countries.
Yeah, it just seems like Lukashenko's trying to get the most out of the deal before Belarus ceases to exist as an independent country.
Yeah, I would think so. I can't find any other, actual persuadable reason.
Now, it's interesting because, as we'll get into later with the whole Iran debacle, global energy prices are going to start going up. And Ukraine has pretty much, I imagine for the next, month or so, that's probably how long this little dispute will last. Russian energy has been cut off mostly from Ukraine, since a lot of it goes through Belarus.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't, it's been ages since I read, where Ukraine is getting its energy supplies from. I know back in 2014, 15, even 2016, there was, the ongoing siphoning off, even post Maidan. But I haven't looked in that direction for quite a while. So I don't feel comfortable saying one thing or the other about it. But Ukraine's contract is coming up, and oil and gas prices are going up.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting to see how the circumvention of U.S. sanctions comes into play with Iran, because I know, again, we'll talk about this a bit later, but
Hmm.
I know China said they are going to buck them. I know Russia said, look, this doesn't matter. I'm interested to see, European Union amongst both the populace and the, establishment. There's been dissent. I don't imagine, but again, that's topic for a different day. But speaking of the EU, we're going to get right into the EU elections. There's been some interesting developments. So let me just pull up the polls for France and Italy, since those are the two major ones here. So the EU elections are just over a month away, and things are looking very positive for the populists and nationalists. Now, the main countries to watch in this upcoming election are particularly France and Italy. Now, for Italian polls, as you'll see on the screen, the bottom poll, Lega Nord, Salvini's party, is up at 33% from 6% in 2014. Five Star Movement, which is the actual governing party with Conte and Di Maio, is up from 22%, and they're up from 21% last election. Social Democrats are at 21%, down from 41% in 2014. Now, these are the three main parties. I mean, there's the other parties. Now, in terms of the French elections, the LREM, the yellow you'll see on the screen here, is at 22%. RN, which I think is the rebranding of Front National, which is Le Pen's party, they're down a few percent, but they're still at 20, so they're still looking at a second place victory. And again, this is several regional districts, so it's not like one wins the entire country, but again, it's how many seats they win throughout the country. Since the way the European Parliament's structured, it's kind of like Congress, where each country is divided up into districts and they send their delegates to the body. But things are looking very good for both of them. And of course, the establishment is not happy because, as I'll pull up here, a tweet by Guy Verhofstadt, who's of course one of these European elites, says, let me just get right into it. He says, quote, Salvini's pro-Russian far-right coalition is a threat to prosperity of all European peoples. They betray our European values, and we must unite to reject their hatred.
Yeah, yeah. They're in panic mode. I mean, if it were up to him, the sanctions would go on indefinitely with Russia. But I think he probably knows most of all that, once Merkel leaves office, Germany will probably work even harder to form stronger economic ties and
Oh
relations with
yeah,
Russia.
I'm going to get into that, but
Yeah, yeah.
it's interesting because this comes from a man who's been part of the elite that has seen Southern Europe, particularly Italy and Greece, pillaged, and he has the gall to scold these nations for rebelling against the European establishment and not joining in their suicidal liberal crusade against Russia. I mean, these sanctions have done nothing but harm the Italian economy. Now, France has fared a bit better; they have a better economy, but Southern and Eastern Europe have not seen any benefit from sanctioning Russia. In fact, they've seen detrimental reasons, especially in Italy's case, from the sanctions on Russia. And he has the gall to come out and say, you know, you don't want to stand up, to the Russians. You must just hate Europe because you want to stand for your own national interests and not want to cripple your economy because Russia doesn't accept whatever ex-liberal value we care about today.
Right. Also, it's the same argument as the threat of the GOP, the GDP. Sorry. The threats are always economic. If you go this way, you're going to be really poor. You don't want that to happen, do you? Um, so it's kind of like, I mean, it's the argument, of course, is for high standing values, for values that supersede purely materialistic arguments for state. But when things are going poorly, of course, you twist the arm, as it were, by threatening economic disparity. And the truth is, Southern Europe, as you just mentioned, has suffered economically for many many years now. They are probably thinking, how could it get worse?
Yeah,
Not to mention France.
and what's interesting is Verhofstadt, like what these neoliberals will usually do, and say you'll suffer economically. Verhofstadt didn't even go this route that time. Apparently, it's beyond that because he knows he can't make a coherent argument for that. But on an unrelated note to all of this, Germany is drifting further and further towards Russia on all sides of the political spectrum. I mean, a German lawmaker came out the other day. He was unnamed in the article I got it from, but He was from the ADF, which is their right-wing populist party, and he
Yeah.
said, "quote Anti-Russian sanctions only benefit U.S. firms at Europeans' expense."
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I would say, I would add just one other thing. There was a story on Zero Hedge about, Germany asking the right to, to arm some of the new American bombers with nuclear weapons. I mean, they have all the necessities, right? They're basically arguing that they have the vectors available for the deployment of nuclear weapons. And initially you're going to think like, well, what does that have to do with the EU? But let's not forget that Germany is continuing to make requests to become a permanent member of the Security Council. And that this trend goes all the way back to Jean Chirac, who specifically wanted Germany to have a seat, and that's a French president.
Yeah.
So what that tends to signal is that whatever is being said, there is preparation for a Europe that has not more but less American presence. At the moment, it's going to be sold the same way that rearming Japan is being sold, that they can take care of American interests for America, that they can carry the big stick. However, long term, that won't be probably, in the next 50 years, won't necessarily be a concern or a very large concern for them. So I would say that Germany requesting this, because of course, Britain is also asking to be, to have a permanent member, and also even the Italians, of course, are upset about this. So no one wants an EU representative, and you have several countries that are for Germany having a representative on the Security Council, permanently. And so now there's the potential of 3 European powers, excluding Russia, to have seats there. That to me signals basically the decline of American power within Europe and the preparation for more autonomy.
Yeah, and this is on a semi-related note, but I've hammered on and on that not only amongst the European nationalists is autonomy from America becoming more popular, it's becoming more popular amongst even people like Merkel and Macron, because at least early on, maybe not so much now, maybe now that he's been tamed, but Trump seemed like he presented a threat and wasn't necessarily going to stand with Europe in it. But of course, things have unfortunately changed since then. But it's interesting since you're seeing, both sides of the spectrum on that, which is pretty much the spectrum in European politics. Are you a populist or are you a neoliberal? They're both drifting away from the U.S. And it's interesting because you mentioned,
Yes.
Merkel, and Merkel plays this weird game where she wants Russian energy, but she still wants to treat Russia as a geopolitical enemy. Pretty much, she said she was retiring, but the successor she nominated wasn't even German. It was Macron, but we all have seen how Macron's presidency has worked. I mean, we just had a yellow vest riot on a Thursday today. I mean, that does not. They happen on Saturdays. We just had one on a Thursday. It's
Right,
insane.
right.
And that's because he made concessions to them. They still rioted anyway, which is amazing. Don't get me wrong, but yeah,
They're smelling blood.
yeah, I mean, once Merkel finally resigns, Germany, maybe not the ADF, but the ADF is going to maintain a major role in German politics. Not, if not a ruling party, part of a ruling coalition, as the major opposition party. Again, the European Union, it may exist in name, but it's not going to exist the way it did, pre-Merkel. It's not going to... Once Merkel steps down, the EU as we know it, if not altogether, is dead.
Yeah, I would say so. And we're about, 2 years from that now?
Yeah, 2021. I think it'll probably be September 2021 by the time she leaves.
That's right. Yeah, it's about 2.5 years.
If an election is forced before then, which who knows?
Right, right. Yeah, so they're going to play a lesser. The E is going to play a lesser role, and Germany is, I think, preparing for perhaps a very different kind of EU, a much smaller EU, maybe filled with mostly German states and a few others, perhaps France even. However, they have to prepare either for no EU or a smaller EU. And in my estimation, they're already taking the steps necessary to do that.
Yeah, and not to like say like, oh, I was right, my prediction came true, but one of my predictions I made, seems to be panning out. I mean, you have Salvini and Le Pen. Le Pen, who most likely her or one of her cohorts are going to be the next president of France come 2022. And then, of course, once Spain likely takes power, like once Vox likely takes power in Spain, you're probably going to get a Southern European coalition. You already have the V4 with Hungary, Poland, and Czech Republic and Slovakia. You're already seeing these several smaller blocks within the European Union starting to form. And as the European Union dissolves, those are probably going to be the future of Europe. These, 3, 4, 5 country blocks that, cooperate with each other, probably have trade agreements with each other. And, maybe they're not going to be, like, outright hostile towards these other European blocks, but they're not going to be cooperative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that.
But I did want to move on. Speaking of, the Russian influence in the EU elections, which I'm sure we'll hear, all about. But speaking of Russia and Europe, I wanted to touch on the Novichok story from about a year ago. Trust me, it's relevant. It's become relevant again.
Yeah.
And honestly, it's hilarious, and believe it or not, it gives me a slight bit of hope. And I'll get into that in a minute. So in March 2018, defector Sergei Skripal was allegedly poisoned by the Russians using the Novichok nerve agent. Now, this led to immediate outrage from many Western countries who all expelled a significant amount of Russian diplomats. Now, the United States alone expelled 60. Now, from the beginning, I didn't see any evidence to back up the official narrative, and to this day, almost 14 months later, there's still no evidence to back this up. Now there are new reports coming from the New York Times, so take that as you will, take it with a grain of salt, that Trump was reluctant to expel Russian diplomats at first, until being convinced to do so by then Deputy Director of the CIA, who is currently the Director of the CIA, Gina Haspel. Now, keep in mind, Haspel succeeded Pompeo at the CIA after Pompeo was appointed to the State Department. Now, the Novichok incident, in my opinion, is what derailed any attempt by Trump to mend U.S.-Russian relations. Despite my initial optimism in the summer of last year, friendly faces, handshakes, and a few kind words in Helsinki mean absolutely nothing in the big picture.
Yeah, this looks like another bungle in Western intelligence. You have to appreciate, though, the way it was handled.
The ducks.
The ducks, that's right. There were supposed to be these Skripal's kids were supposed to have fed the ducks some bread. And then the bread was passed off to 3 other children who wanted to. And of course, none of them tested positive for poisoning. The other children, and the ducks, didn't die. But you have to like how judiciously this story was handled. It was made big when it had to be, and then when it looked like it wasn't going to pan out, of course, to reduce the impact, the negative impact, the story was just not reported on the same level, and so I really appreciate the way they've handled it.
Yeah, kind of like it's almost like Venezuela in a sense, where they realized it wasn't a winning issue, so they sort of just swept it under the rug.
Yeah. Just to hide the negative impact of it all. It's
yeah.
That's a good comparison.
But the funny things about this New York Times piece was it presented Haspel's manipulation, because that's what it was, as like this positive thing, like, oh, don't worry, the good guys, the resistance, they're inside the Trump administration, they're going to stop him from fixing our relationship with Russia.
It's so ridiculous. It's again, old Trump, the Trump that we lost, sadly. He was very hesitant about this. He initially made some statements to the effect of,
"We don't have
that's
any
just
evidence.
what spies do." Yeah, that's just what spies do. Duh. I really miss those days. But his initial instincts that this maybe wasn't what it appeared. and was merely something, certain machinations that the UK felt it needed to achieve. Well, it did work, and what was it? Something like at least 40 Russian diplomats were expelled.
It
12,
was 48 from the DCMC and 12
right?
from a UN
60, yeah,
delegation. So
that's
total of
right.
60. But
Yeah,
it's an amazing story how it panned out. There's no evidence. Like, your common person doesn't even accept it. Like, um, I remember, because I was very big into this when it first happened. Like, it was pretty much all I tweeted about for a week after it happened. I spent a lot of time on British Twitter because, of course, that's what was happening. But you had all these people, like, it's interesting because the British left, the very, like, pro Jeremy Corbyn left, didn't believe it. But then you had some conservatives who just detested Theresa May, saying, look, I absolutely hate Jeremy Corbyn. I think he's a moron on every other issue. But he's got a point. We have no evidence that the Russians did this.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's just generally there's a all across the West. There's a real deflation, a lack of trust, a lack of trust in the media, lack of trust in government and the institutions, including intelligence. There was going. We were always. This was always going to happen, right? Especially after the Iraq War in 2003, and in a way, that's made it ever more difficult for intelligence agencies in the West to appear legitimate and appear. I mean, we have newspaper articles that are writing, well, she lied, and it was a good thing that she lied, because we don't have the evidence, but who really did this, right? It's headlines that you never would have read from major publications 10 years ago.
Now, I do want to expound on your point in terms of, like, how this was pretty much inevitable, all the events happening. Now, we look at it. Now, post-Cold War, a lot of countries, even Eastern European countries who were just under Soviet occupation, said, let bygones be bygones. Communism is dead in Russia too. Let's try to build a, semi-prosperous and cooperative future with them. And then the populists started to come along in Western Europe again, such as Salvini, such as Le Pen, saying, look, the Cold War's over. Russia's not a threat to us. They're just another European country, so let's work with them like we'd work with any other European country. And you're seeing that attitude spread to Germany. It seems like the Anglosphere, specifically US, UK, Canada, Australia, etc., are really dragging their heels on that attitude.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that is, investments towards the strategy of balkanizing Russia, which has been going on at least since the 1850s, 1840s.
What is it, Lord Salisbury's letter? Is that?
Yeah, even prior to that. But yes, that would be definitely a highlight from the early 1890s. But I mean, even The Hill published an article, outlining how to properly cause the dissolution of Russia.
Yeah, I saw that, and then I saw South
saw that, right?
The response saying, is Russia going to collapse, or do they want it to collapse?
Yeah, I've been to Russia several times, and Russia's not going to collapse.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, the sanctions have made them stronger both economically and culturally. I mean, imagine if Obama got his way, where we had full cooperation with Russia. We might see those pride parades in Moscow right now. Who knows? So, Russian sanctions could have actually been the best thing that actually happened to them.
Right. It's made them very defensive. I mean, but I don't see the kind of, yes, there are enclaves, there are small pockets. Some of them are, a little larger, like Chechnya, that are not ethnic Russians, but are Russians in sort of the broader term,
yeah,
or with the lowercase r. But
Russia has managed to govern ethnic minorities for centuries, and they haven't collapsed so far.
Right, exactly, and we've discussed this many times. It's the case in China as well. They're kept in different regions, wherein with the U.S. and the West, of course, there is apparently an explicit need to become even more diverse and to not allow any place to fragment that way. I can understand some of the reasons for that, but the long and short of it is trading, one form of violence for another. But
Yeah.
that's neither here nor there. Anyhow, so yes, the Anglosphere, of course, I think is very worried about Russia in the future. I think they sense that there isn't a European power up to the task to rein in Russia if Russia wanted to expand. That's part of it. The other part of it, of course, has to deal with wealth and has to deal with the Anglo hegemony that's been in existence for, well, at least 250 years or so. And Russia has looked at this great potential problem without ways of containing it from either side, because it stretches literally from North America into Europe and is resource rich and is next to and shares a border with the upcoming economy. So yeah, they see themselves challenged by that, but you don't see Germany particularly worried about it. And I think if maybe France was perhaps a little bit more independent, or maybe behind closed doors, they would probably also agree that they're not
give France
afraid of
5
Russia.
years. That's all I'm gonna say.
Yeah, yeah.
But I will say this, not to drone on too long about it. Now you said the Anglo elite are probably worried that they don't have a challenger to Russia. Now I will push back on that. Now, for example, I think in the 1 in a million chance Russia invaded Poland, a coalition of Visegrad states could probably repel an invasion. Not that they could push into Moscow and take out Putin or whatever. But again, this is all very far fetched hypothetical scenario. I think they're worried there's not a power that can counter Russia from a liberal perspective. Like again, Germany, the way it's shifting,
Yes,
France is
yes, yeah.
shifting. Like they can stand toe to toe with Russia, and if war to break out, they could probably hold their own against Russia. But are they going to impose the liberal values after the war? Is the question. Which that's what they're nervous about.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. That's an excellent point. That Russia's presence represents not so much an existential threat, but rather an ideological one. Um, the subtext is that modernity itself is in question.
Yeah, the
And
entire post 1918 world order, which look, most people say post 1945. I'll go as far as post 1918. The entire post 1918 world order is being called into question.
right, that's a machination of it. But one of the reasons I use modernity is that modern life itself um, creates the circumstances, let's say, for a lot of the liberal policies that we have. Now that we have experimented with it, especially culturally, and we are not seeing long-term positive results. In fact, we're seeing enormous problems that we'll have to deal with in the future. Uh, Russia represents a possibility of, a certain direction that can be taken. What each country will have to do to, live in a modern world, but avoid some of the modern pitfalls that a modern world would have. And of course, here I mean everything from like female emancipation, because of course, relatively safe and profitable jobs are open to women. This is going to have consequences on birth rates and so on. There's a market that's designed to function for constant growth. The idea of not structuring a society completely on economic growth
Yeah.
seems out of the question. So that's what I mean. And I don't even think Russia necessarily has an answer to this. They themselves are reacting to this world, to the modern world, and to the West. But they're also relying on a kind of a kind of bedrock identity that they've had for a very long time. And yeah, so
now,
I won't go on any further with it.
Just to put it simply before I move on to the Golan Heights stuff, because I want to go on that. Russia, simply put it, at least at appearance, presents an alternative to liberalism without a full embrace of totalitarianism.
Right, right,
Now,
right. And I think Eastern European countries have a better grasp at this because I think what's happening in the West, in some ways, is far more fundamental than what's happening in Eastern Europe.
yeah,
That is, Eastern Europe is more connected to their past. Anyhow, I'm going on and on.
Yeah, good discussion nonetheless. But I did want to talk about our special event in the Golan Heights. So, as a great thank you message for all Trump did to help BB win the election, he has decided to reward him with a settlement in the Golan Heights named after Trump. So I'm vacationing in Trump Town this summer. How about you?
That sounds amazing. Golan Blumph. It's just what it's very cringe. It's very cringe. It's kind of like when Poland wanted to create Fort Drumpf.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, how many like are the Donald tier people do you think are gonna go on vacations to the Trump Town settlement or whatever?
I don't think you really ever want to find out.
Oh boy, it's gonna be like organized trips, like Republican Party establishment's gonna be organizing these things. Take a trip to Trump Town, he's making America great again. The Golan Heights is Israeli territory, our greatest ally. But it's just so ridiculous.
It's embarrassing.
I sold out my base and all I got was this lousy settlement named after me in return.
I know, and you think like I want to after this, I want to know how popular is professional wrestling in Israel, because this is literally like it's on that level. Like I can imagine stuff like that happening in the States. Basically like wherever professional wrestling is really big, the greater the chance that like something like that could happen.
Yeah,
so I have to ask about it.
There's more grandiose, kind of like celebrity like cult of personality sort of thing. But yeah, that is good. That is a good question. But speaking of the Golan Heights, let's talk about its rightful owner, Syria.
Yeah.
So I have a brief war report from Syria. We're on the war report, and I have a brief war report from Syria. So the situation in Syria hasn't changed drastically, but there's been a few developments. So Russia's continued strikes in the outskirts of Idlib, hitting HTS and various militant targets. Now, an IED exploded in the Nair Aisha area near Damascus, and it killed 1 and injured 5. I believe those are all military personnel. So another IED exploded in western Idlib, killing 9 and wounding 15. And that was an attack blamed on ISIS by actual HTS forces. So, again, more of that militant infighting. And militants have been shelling Syrian positions in western Aleppo's. Pro-militant news sources also claim that Russian warplanes have entered over Idlib city's airspace. Now, Russia's been striking targets in Idlib province, but not specifically the city, which is like their last stronghold. And pro-government sources are also claiming that the militant Idlib are planning for another staged chemical attack, which, again, they're very overzealous with these claims, so, take it as you will. I think, okay, yeah, there's a fair possibility, but I'm not expecting it, to be anything imminent. There hasn't been the action leading up to it, such as we saw in, Ghouta or, the 2017 lead up to that. So, again, it wouldn't surprise me, but I think there would have to be, again, a bit more push into Idlib province before we actually got that.
Yeah, and unfortunately, there's also been several casualties of SAA government forces in the western section of the country around Latakia. 5 in one area, 15 in another. So the war, in many ways, is still going on, and I do worry about just how much and how much longer can Syria maintain this.
Yeah, it seems like the new strategy is they're trying to pretty much bleed Syria out by grinding the war to a small, low burn, but not letting the flame go extinguished.
Yeah, which is something we were discussing last year as well.
Which I'll actually get into with U.S. oil sanctions on Syria and what Russia's doing in Crimea and their shipping plans. But yeah, I'll get in that. But you go on.
Yeah, right. So that's the number one thing. I'm like, there has been in the last 2 weeks a new wave of, not really at the level that we saw, of course, back in 2014, 15, and 16, but especially 2014. But there has been a wave of ISIS attacks, successful ones, and not just in the western part of the country, but also in the northeast near the Euphrates. So yeah, I mean that's all I had to say about it. Was that I wish some of these areas that are still that are de facto under Syrian government control. That we're not talking about the Kurdish section or Idlib. Would have hopefully rooted them out longer. My guess is that they are finding shelter even amongst maybe perhaps the Kurds
Yeah.
or other areas, and that they're managing to sneak through. It could even be Iraq. Um, I'm sure it will eventually be uncovered.
Yeah, and it's interesting, as I was saying. So the U.S. pretty much restricted, put oil sanctions on Syria, and a lot of Syrian oil is under control of the Kurdish territory. It's in the northeastern part of the country. But there are things being done to counteract this, which at least one of them should work. And again, it may not. There may be hope yet for stability in Syria because the Syrian government actually made an official agreement with the Crimean government, not just the Russian government, but the Crimean government in particular, on getting oil shipments from Crimea to Tartus to keep the Syrian war machine going because that's one of their big concerns now. Like they're not like near like imminent levels now, but they're afraid that oil shortage will affect the war effort. And also, we were talking about the reconnection of highways between Syria, Turkey, and also Syria and Iraq. And now Iran, which is on better terms with Iraq. So you might see oil shipments going from Iran to Syria through Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
Which we're gonna have to
Yeah,
watch for
that's
that, since we might see like some accidental drone strikes on some of those oil tankers traveling through Iraq.
right, and this I think it explains very well some of the statements that one of the admirals was saying yesterday about this carrier represents 100,000 tons of American diplomacy and so on. But that's an interesting development, considering that a month or two ago we were afraid that perhaps we would see an incident in the Kerch Strait in the Sea of Azov. And that hasn't happened. The election has come and gone.
Yeah,
So
it seems like they've kind of given up on that when the initial push in November didn't get anywhere. Again, one of those issues like Venezuela, like Novichok, that it didn't pan out, so they just kind of swept it under the rug.
yeah, very much.
But yeah, so keep your eye on that. Again, they're probably not going to send too much oil through Iraq, because of fears that the U.S. may take action against oil tankers traveling through Iraq, and it's probably going to be mainly through Crimea to Tartus. And the U.S. has been increasing naval presence in the Mediterranean, but again, how much more are these countries going to put up with? As I've been saying for a while, I see a U.S.-Italian rift coming, and I'll get into that when we talk about Iran. But pretty much, here's your last look at the war map. That's the state of the conflict right now. But I wanted to get on to a little bit of Libya news before I got into the whole debacle with Iran. So there's
Sure.
there's your war map for Libya. There's the key for that, and um, there's been some interesting developments in Libya. Nothing major, but interesting nonetheless. So, 2 days ago, there were airstrikes on Gna Forces, which, as you'll see on the map, is the blue, by a foreign nation. Now, many speculate this was either the French Air Force or the United Arab Emirates, which has provided limited military support to Haftar's LNA. Many speculate that they were responsible. Now, as of yesterday, the LNA has shot down one Mirage F1 fighter, which was targeting an LNA airfield. Now, the LNA also launched strikes which killed 4 GNA fighters and wounded 7 others. And the Battle of Tripoli is brewing, with fighting near the airport going on as we speak. It seems like that's really where they're trying to push through their invasion. Of course, I know civilian airport, not exactly military grade, but if you can capture a civilian airport, you can rig it somewhat to fit military
Hmm.
needs.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah. Sorry, I thought I lost you.
Uh, yeah, I don't have much more to say on that unless you have any more comments.
I haven't. I've been just sort of briefly looking at Libya here and there, but I haven't looked at it too closely.
Well, it's it's
Um,
it's sort of grinded to a halt. I think there's probably some outside force, maybe the U.S. for all we know. Granted, the U.S. has been very wishy-washy on whoever's side is with Libya. It seems like Haftar is afraid to go into Tripoli for some reason, whether he thinks too many casualties as it would stand, whether it would provoke a foreign response, or some other reason.
Right, right. I mean, it's hard to say, and it's hard to say if there's a strategy here for a long grinding out war, the kind that we're seeing in Syria. I'm not sure what is happening. Also, you have countries like Egypt, which along with Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates and Kuwait, you know, literally stopped speaking to Qatar 2 years ago. And on the other hand, they're in North Africa, they're essentially supporting various partners.
Yeah, I mean, you have France, Russia, and the Gulf states all supporting one side in Libya. That's how convoluted this conflict is.
Yeah, this is what I mean. It's very, very. I find it very convoluted. I don't quite understand what is happening there.
Yeah, I mean, again, I just want one side to win. I mean, look, I'm rooting for Haftar because it seems like, yeah, he seems the most stable option, and it looks like he's going to win anyway. But yeah, it's such a convoluted conflict that the U.S. hasn't even taken a side officially yet.
Right. Yeah, I'm with you. And anything that ends the conflict, the sooner the better.
Now, not to drag on too long, since
Um,
we're at almost an
yeah,
hour. I wanted to
yeah.
get
Go ahead.
into some stuff about Iran before we get into some of the stuff about Kim and Putin. So,
Yep.
the U.S. announced on Monday that it will be ending oil sanctions waivers on Iranian oil, which will take effect on May 2nd. Now, this is no surprise considering the recent moves from the Trump administration. Now, for those of you wondering, Black Pigeon Speaks, I'll actually link this in the description. He made a great video on that, which I will be referencing heavily throughout this segment. So, if you want to learn more about that, it's fantastic. You should, give it a watch. Now,
Yeah, highly recommended.
the U.S. is also taking other interesting moves on sanctions to Iran in terms of exemptions. Now, foreign governments and businesses that have dealings with the IRGC, which the U.S. recently declared a terrorist organization, and its affiliates will not be subject to certain bans in the U.S. Now, Iran hawks have criticized Trump on this, and again, it goes to show that Trump's sort of dragging his heels, whereas the people around him want the war, so the war is probably going to come post-Trump, whether that be in 2021 or 2025. It depends, but I'll get into more of that later. But this is said to deter possible retaliations to American working in the region, such as Iraq and Lebanon. Now, in terms of the sanctions waiver, pretty much what we had sanctions on several Iranian industries, just all out. But the oil, we said, look, the U.S. isn't buying your oil, but we won't stop other people from buying your oil. And that changed as of Monday, that announcement, again, which will take effect next week. So in response, China outright said that it will not acknowledge U.S. sanctions, and India previously said they would honor them, but has gone back on that, said, no, we're not honoring U.S. sanctions. Your Iranian oil is more important than whatever insane crusade you have or whatever, feud you have with the Iranians. And this will create friction between the U.S. and a lot of Asian countries in particular, but also a lot of European countries. Now,
Mhm.
it's interesting because Japan, South Korea, China, several Southeast Asian nations get a lot of oil exports from Iran, of course, through the Strait of Hormuz. Italy does as well. A lot of I know Turkey does, not through the strait, but through pipelines, and I believe Greece is the other one. So you're seeing the European Union get a lot of oil from Iran. You're seeing Asian countries get a lot of oil from Iran. Now, countries like South Korea, which are more dependent on the U.S., will probably have to bend the knee. But that probably applies to like some of these countries like the Philippines. But Japan's coming to the point, again, with its military buildup, where it can sort of drift away from the U.S. influence, not entirely. China, of course, isn't under U.S. influence. In fact, many would consider it a rival. And you're seeing, Italy and a lot of these European countries that, yeah, they're under U.S. protection, but they're also capable of fending for themselves in some regards. So, look, I'm not surprised that, China and India have said no, screw off, we're not following the sanctions. But I wouldn't be surprised, especially with, the bold moves Salvini and the Italian government taken lately, if the Italians take a similar move saying, look, we're not going to jeopardize our energy source because you have a feud with the Iranians.
Yeah, I agree. Salvini, I think, is quite capable of doing something like this. Um, him more than most European politicians at the moment seem to have spot a kind of weakness, the kind of deals that he's already creating with China. I think he's played even some roles with, or at least was on the sidelines with some of the deals. Well, some of the agreements, not deals, between Switzerland and China for an alternative to SWIFT. So I think he really does have his ear to the ground. So yeah, I think that's a definite possibility.
And as I was saying, I was referencing the Black Pigeon Speaks a lot because he actually made a lot of points we've been making on the show. Now I doubt he's been watching the show, but again, I'd like to think it's one of those great minds think alike thing. Not to praise myself
He
for
is
too
watching the show. Trust me. He's watching. No.
if he is, cool. You want to come on? I mean, we'd be more than happy to have you on
That would be
sometime.
awesome.
Yeah. Great for these kind of analysis, but not to sing his praise too much. But okay, to sing his praises, I'll just admit it. I got a thing for the guy. But aside the point, he made a very good point that the U.S. wants to forego its obligations of defending these European and Asian nations, saying, look, it's America first, on one hand, but on the other hand, we want them to follow what we tell them, say, oh, you must follow our imperial will, you cannot trade with this country, you have no right to trade with this country. So, again, other U.S. presidents could do that because they could leverage, like, oh, I guess we'll just stop defending them. But then you have Trump, who's, somewhat rolled up back on this, not entirely, saying, look, you got to go along with this. But again, you can't have it both ways, and that's the big problem Trump has had. And it's
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned this a few.
Yeah, go on.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
But it's going to be pretty much these things in name only. Like, the U.S. is going to do everything it can to prevent these countries from getting Iranian oil, but especially now, especially like a year and a half before the elections, they're going to do everything in their possibility not to spark an all-out war. I mean, maybe after the 2020 election, either way, they might. But again, over these next, I don't know, 16 months or so, they're going to do everything they can to curtail this, but not start a war. But they're not going to be able to. And it's ultimately going to be ineffective. You're going to see oil continue to go to Europe. You're going to see oil continue to go to Asia. And the U.S. is going to get egg on its face and look ridiculous. And again, we still have the raw military strength, but you've seen under Bush, under especially Obama, and even under Trump, that the U.S. has all this power, yet they don't have the capital or the seeming competency to exert it.
Right. And we've been making these points all of last year, essentially saying that, there's a schizophrenic policy here. On the one hand, we're going to cut back on NATO. On the other hand, we're still going to exert our will as if we were paying more.
Yeah. Just to interrupt real quick, I have a breaking news item on Libya. This is from South Front.
Sure.
Apparently, the F-1 warplane shot down in Libya. The LNA downed its own aircraft. So that's just a small update.
Oh, boy. What a fail. Oh, my God. Yeah, but I mean, we've been making these points for quite some time, for at least a year, that the policy literally makes no sense. And as a result, it's going to alienate America even more so. And that was an essential message in the Black Pigeon Speaks video, that they're accelerating their own alienation and decline in doing so. I mean, we've mulled over how does an empire go back to being a nation, and those are always very difficult transitions. One only need to look at the UK. But
yeah, and that's what Trump has promised, but that's not what, I place the blame mainly on Bolton Pompeo, but that's not what Bolton Pompeo have in mind.
Yeah. I mean, Trump has obviously been compromised. So.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think, if this were 100% Trump's administration, I doubt these moves would be happening. But again, foreign policy, Bolton and Pompeo control us. Domestic policy, Jared Kushner and Ivanka control us. So Trump is just a puppet of whoever he's being, talked to by that day. So, that's the thing. Now, many have also had fears that Iran would close the Strait of Hormuz. And despite my comments last week, I'm going to go back on that. Now, it would be extremely unwise for Iran to close the strait, but seeing the absolute rebellion against the new U.S. announcement from, particular Asian countries, but I imagine as it goes on, European countries, how many countries would stand with the U.S. in the, event of an American-Iranian face-off? I mean, Israel and Saudi Arabia, but none of them would contribute anything of significance.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an obvious point. Um, China and India depend on it, and this is going to have incredible consequences. It's not really, as much as they say will rattle for a war against Iran, and this might be the pretext for it. Um, it will not go well. Yeah, like you, I don't see the support. Dragging Europe into it um, will, I think, exacerbate the problem.
I mean, it's the Achilles heel of the American empire, no matter how you cut it. You look domestically, the American people are not going to be happy with another war, especially war on the scale Iran. Now, I doubt they're dumb enough to ever try a draft again in absence of an existential crisis against the United States, seeing as how Vietnam went. I mean, again, instead of a bunch of hippies, you'd have a bunch of semi-autistic right-wing Zoomers saying no more wars for Israel at protests. So, um, but domestically, it would be horrid. Nobody wants another war. Geopolitically, we would isolate our allies, inflame tensions with Russia and China, which again nobody wants. I mean, nobody aside from again the usual suspects. But again, this is war with Iran is the death of America.
Yeah, I think that's going to raise, the public tensions that are already, the civic tensions that are already in the states.
Especially
I think
coupled
are
with an
going to be
economic downturn, which is inevitable, just the way our economy has been for the past 100 years. We're due for an economic downturn sometime in the early 2020s.
right. Yeah, that's an important thing to look at. Also, it will bind. I think it will bind the left and the right. Both will be non-interventionist, non-war when it comes to Iran, and I don't think they can sell it like we have to help Iranian women shed the hijab or the, the head covering and so on. That's been tried.
The
Um,
threat to Israel thing got tried all throughout the early 2000s, all under Bush, even somewhat under Obama. They don't have that. The threat to American interests, again, there's not even enough they can scrape together, especially now with the way the energy market's turning, with American energy independence growing. Again, the three things they would have justified it on are all they all fall on deaf ears.
right, and the argument that the Democrats will have, of course, is is ruining Obama's legacy. He scrapped the deal just because of Benjamin Netanyahu, and that's not going to be good for Israel either. Uh, and this is what I mean about the right and the left are going to agree on this, especially the more extreme sections or the more progressive and sections of the Democrats will definitely not be in favor of this war,
Yeah, I mean,
including.
you're gonna have Antifa and Wignats at the anti-war protests together. That's what levels we're going to be on.
That's right. That's right. So yeah, we've talked about it. There's a war exhaustion, and nobody wants something that would be at least on the scale of Iraq. Uh,
I would say I'd say on the scale of Vietnam, if anything. But let's close out the show with oh no, correction. There's one thing I want to cover first, just briefly. So, Nicaragua is the new Venezuela in terms of what the neocons are freaking out about, because apparently there's Venezuela just didn't have enough staking power. Enough people didn't care about it. So, of course, there's been videos of citizens and refugees complaining about the current president, Ortega, like they didn't put him in power and let him ruin the country. Like, again, these people vote for their own demise and they are surprised when the incompetent leaders that they voted for destroy their country. So, again, they're trying to make us feel sympathy for another Latin American nation, which, again, U.S. policy didn't help, but ultimately destroyed itself.
right, right. Yeah, now that Venezuela's not really working out as planned, Nicaragua is going to be the new project.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and in my opinion,
no,
has even less sticking power than Venezuela. I mean, like
oh,
Venezuela,
I agree.
people point to the gold, point to the oil, both on the pro and con side. But what's Nicaragua have? Like nobody, it's so insignificant in the mind of especially the average American. It's not going to stick at all.
Right, and especially boomer Americans will just look at Nicaragua as this unfortunate episode in the 80s uh, with American interventionism there, and they're not, they're that's really the only way people know Nicaragua. People literally know Nicaragua from the Iran Contra scandal, massacres that occurred there. And all the connotations are terrible. There isn't any good optics here to sell the war.
No, absolutely not. I mean, pretty much, you say Iran, you think the Contras, the Sandinistas, and the Iran-Contra, affair. Those are the three things that come to
Mm-hmm.
mind, none of which are good.
Yeah.
But in terms of good news, so yesterday, April 24th, Kim Jong Un traveled from Pyongyang to Vladivostok to meet with Vladimir Putin, as I mentioned last week. Now, the two actually met today, and they planned. What they did is they held a private meeting, and then they held meetings within delegations in public with the media there. Now, there were no plans at the start of the meeting to sign any treaties, trade agreements, or joint declarations. Now, of course, they signed the treaties that pretty much are just in rhetoric only. But I do want to read some of the statements since it was apparently a very friendly meeting. So I'll pull this up real quick. If my computer will cooperate, but um, so if you have anything more to expound on while while I try to pull
Right.
this up.
I've been watching the Korean news on this, and they're basically echoing Korean news, and they're doing some of the points Western media was doing and American media was doing, and that is there's nothing Russia that can offer them. He's just doing this to tell Trump, to signal to Trump that there's other players. Putin is doing this to look relevant and so on. But there was something about that I have misgivings about. The truth is, first of all, in 2014, Russia basically forgave North Korea's debt. Of course, Russia still has these laborers that literally work for almost nothing in Russia and send money back to North Korea. But Russia is also invested in Korea denuclearizing. It's not just America. The same with China, the same with Japan, the same with South Korea. Everybody wants North Korea to denuclearize. My hunch is that the reason Kim is going to Putin is that Putin is perceived not just somebody capable of brokering, but more importantly, someone who can offer some kind of protection vis-a-vis armaments
Yeah.
that can make the nuclear war obsolete.
Yeah, and I'm also
And
thinking that probably energy reasons, like if the U.S. decides to
oh yeah,
slap
so
down tough energy sanctions, again, there's a pipeline all of a sudden.
that's right. Yeah, that's right. I was going to touch on that too, and that could also bode well for South Korea as well.
Yeah, I mean, imagine building a pipeline from Russia through the Koreas, especially if the demilitarization continues. Which again, between North Korea and South Korea, it doesn't look like there's been any like breakdown of negotiations on like North Korea and the U.S. But I do have some of the statements pulled up made during the meeting.
Sure.
So during the one-on-one meeting, Putin said, "Dear Mr. Chairman, I'm very pleased to see you in Russia. Our colleagues have been long working on this meeting. First of all, I would like to congratulate you on the election of the high office to the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea. And I sent you a corresponding letter, but now I'm pleased to personally congratulate you. In this regard, I would like to say that last year we celebrated the 70th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between our countries. The founder of the Democratic People's Republic of DPRK made his first visit to Moscow in 1949. I remember my first visit to your country. Your father's was one of the initiators in signing the fundamental treaty, the Treaty of Friendship between our countries. I'm confident that you visit Russia today and will serve to the development of bilateral relations and help us better understand how we can resolve the situation on the Korean Peninsula. What we can do together, what Russia can do to support those positive things in the processes that are happening now. We certainly welcome your efforts to develop inter-Korean dialogue and normalize the North Korean-American relationship. And of course, bilaterally, we have a lot to do to develop trade and economic ties and develop humanitarian contacts." And now, Kim said, "I want to express my gratitude, dear Mr. President, for the fact that they kindly invited me, and despite the extraordinary undertaking, paid deep attention to the implementation of my visit and traveled thousands of kilometers to come here from Moscow and meet me. I would also like to personally congratulate you on the fact that the Russian people once again entrusted you with your leadership of their nation, and the fact that you're successfully working to build a strong Russia. As you noted, I hope that our meeting with you, Mr. President, will be useful for strengthening and developing the traditionally friendly relations between the DPRK and Russia, which have deep roots. I would like to also say that the situation on the Crimea Peninsula is of great interest to the entire world community, and that I hope our talks will be an important event in order to assess the situation together, exchange views on the situation, jointly resolve the issue, and I hope that we will have a meaningful exchange of views today. So again, very flowery, very flattery. It's what you would expect from them to say each other.
Hmm. Yeah. I think it's timely because, first of all, there's a good portion of the world that is working, as we've mentioned in the past, on a swift alternative, and I think there's a feeling that they can be like the sanctions can be curtailed. Putin was in St. Petersburg, I believe, today. I could be wrong, but I think he was in St. Petersburg today for an economic conference, and he was basically talking about making Russia, an ideal spot for business to come to. Everything from like changing tax codes, not just for corporations, but he even mentioned demographics and so on, for the average working Russian family and so on. So my guess is, there was also a lot of talk about sovereignty and like everybody wants to see this thing happen, but how do you ensure sovereignty, right? And essentially that talk, that language, those words are basically indicating how do you have independence from America? That's essentially what that word means nowadays. And I think it's a backhanded way of indicating that the deals that America wants, and America pulled out of North Korea pulled out because it considered the demands that America was asking in 2005 were too great. But that with Pompeo, there isn't really there's no possible deal that can be made from North Korea's perspective. I think there's a feeling that nothing can be achieved. I don't think this is just a ploy. I don't think Kim is merely signaling and that there's no substance to this. I think there is substance to it, and I think in 2 years we're going to see some of that play out.
Now, as I've said in the past, China has somewhat of an interest keeping the peninsula divided, as well as the U.S. Russia seems like the only major power in the world that actually has an interest in seeing a united peninsula, particularly for energy reasons, particularly probably because they want to build a pipeline through the entire Korean peninsula. So I imagine that was probably the impetus of the summit, saying like, look, we have this leader who is often considered the most powerful man in the world. Fluctuates between him, U.S. president, whatever, and he is the one person who supports probably fully a unified Korea. So let's talk to him. That's probably what was going through the North Koreans' head.
Yeah, I think so. And a unified Korea is able to pay more money for that gas than a divided one. Along the same lines, that if Korea becomes a kind of a little sort of secondary energy hub, as it were. Notice also the meetings that Putin also had with Agabe from Japan. So I see Russia basically here with a lot of foresight into the future about, providing energy, basically not just to Korea, but also potentially to Japan. Of course, I'm indicating here the Kuril Islands and some of the deals. So I think North and South Korea are another piece of this jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah, it's interesting because, of course, Russia's been in friendly with China, but it seems like they're also maneuvering to some of China's rivals, such as, the Koreas and Japan, where it's almost kind of like what they do between Russia and India. Yeah, I wouldn't say necessarily play them against each other, but somewhat exploit the rivalries for Russia's interest without entirely playing them against each other. If you understand what I'm getting at.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's frenemies.
Yeah. And yeah, again, Russia just purely even geographically has pretty much always done that, and it's been their strategy, and it's worked, especially in the recent years, swimmingly for them. But I do have to say, now that Kim has met with the leaders of all U.S., China, and Russia, it's likely that again, even if there isn't a full Korean unification, which, like I said, will probably take years, but there'll probably be like a Korean Confederation, as I always go back to. We're pretty much seeing North Korea leaving behind the hermit kingdom sort of persona it had for the past 70 years, seeing it integrate with other countries and actually open up diplomatic relations with other nations, especially within the region. And again, despite some of the fallout and some of the gridlock, the U.S. So it's interesting to see North Korea sort of shed the hermit kingdom identity.
Right, and Russia itself might be thinking about molding, on North Korea in a different way. I get the sense that North Korean leadership is not just hemmed in by sanctions and by militarization around it, but also by an imagination about how to go forward. I kind of see Kim Jong Un as somebody who doesn't really know how to go forward. There are the obvious players. He's talked with Trump, of course, and Pompeo, but I think this is. I don't think this is just show. I think there is significance to this.
Yeah, and in terms of the one of the jokes was at the Korean summit is, oh, North Korea is gonna get McDonald's, and then there's gonna be drag queens, child drag queens in Pyongyang. Yeah, I do have to say, it's interesting because Kim Jong Il, the previous leader, built an Orthodox church in Pyongyang because of his admiration for the Russians. And again, maybe North Korea will find itself becoming Russified. I say that semi-jokingly, but maybe Russian culture will have more of an influence than Western culture on North Korea as the integration process happens.
I think that I think that's a really interesting point. I've mentioned this story before, but I was in Moscow on the 70th anniversary of the Victory Day parade in 2015, and actually I ended up speaking with an ethnic Korean who was born and raised in Russia, north of the North Korean border, and his name was Boris, and we're chatting it up. I mean, we spoke for nearly an hour, and he nudges me with his arm and he says, "We Slavs have to stick together." so I'm bringing that up because my guess is that if the Koreas were rejoined, I think there would be an element of North Korea that is so deeply conservative that they would be perhaps shocked about where South Korea is heading.
Yeah, because South Korea has been like very hyper liberal and like especially like with some of their like feminist movements down there. And again, as North Korea integrates with them, and as if Russian influence grows on the peninsula, especially, we may see like a regression of that in South Korea, which would be interesting because throughout the past 100 years, barring the Iranian Revolution, we haven't really seen a regression of liberalism.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. And also, let's not forget that like many of the Eastern European countries, but also especially the Baltic countries, once the Soviet Union fell, replacement population just plummeted, and they've been plummeting for well over 25 years now. It's not just people leaving; people simply aren't having children, and this is after the fall of the Soviet Union. So, that also, I think, is part of what we would call more conservative values. That for a lot of countries that were liberated, in a sense, it's left them even more empty.
Yeah, I mean they traded one oppressive force for another. Ultimately, I mean things are starting to regress to the pre World War I sort of way of conducting business.
Right.
Again, barring the Anglosphere, we've been really dragging our heels on that one, but that's beside the point. But yeah, it's interesting watching. Like, yeah, we tried communism, we tried socialism, didn't work out. We've tried capitalism, didn't work out. Let's look for something before both of those.
Right. And then we're I guess we're at a stage where we're sort of saying that we've tried liberalism and it too hasn't worked out.
Yeah. Now, just as a final statement, I'm just waiting for the neocons and the liberals to try and say that Trump's meeting was there to set up a Putin Kim summit. That was the entire point of the
That's
yeah. They haven't come out yet, but I imagine there'll be somebody trying to twist it saying
oh
the
yeah,
only
you're
reason
right. Here it comes.
yeah, Trump met with Kim at the behest of Putin, so Kim could go meet with Putin, and then they'll have like, of course, like the conspiracy theorists like tack boards, like putting all like the red strings together, like trying to say like, and this is how Mueller will get Blumpf impeached. That's where they're going
Yeah,
with this.
yeah. Oh, of course, of course. Once again, they'll prove that Putin is literally the most powerful and interesting man in the world.
I mean, again,
Yeah, it'll be just new levels of idiocy.
yeah,
Yeah.
he's orchestrated so many things within his like power, within his grasp. Played so many rivals against each other so perfectly. I mean, again, it's he's fantastic. It's like, how does he control so many people? It's like that octopus thing that I always have for anti-Russian propaganda, whether it be the Russian Empire, Soviet Union, modern Russia. But with that, I will leave you with that, and we can only imagine how the usual suspects will try to twist this meeting. But thank you for tuning in. We will see you guys next time, and goodbye.